Part 7, Book 12, A Judicial Error, Chapter 1, The Fatal Day. At 10 o'clock in the morning of the day following the events I have described, the trial of Dmitry Karamazov began in our district court. I hasten to emphasize the fact that I am far from esteeming myself capable of reporting all that took place at the trial in full detail, or even in the actual order of events. I imagine that to mention everything with full explanation would fill a volume, even a very large one, and so I trust I may not be reproached for confining myself to what struck me. I may have selected as of most interest what was of secondary importance, and may have omitted the most prominent and essential details. But I see I shall do better not to apologize. I will do my best, and the reader will see for himself that I have done all I can. And to begin with, before entering the court, I will mention what surprised me most on that day. Indeed, as it appeared later, everyone was surprised at it, too. We all knew that the affair had aroused great interest, that everyone was burning with impatience for the trial to begin, that it had been a subject of talk, conjecture, exclamation and surmise for the last 2 months in local society. Everyone knew, too, that the case had become known throughout Russia, but yet we had not imagined that it had aroused such burning, such intense interest in everyone, not only among ourselves, but all over Russia. This became evident at the trial this day. Visitors had arrived not only from the chief town of our province, but from several other Russian towns, as well as from Moscow and Petersburg. Among them were lawyers, ladies, and even several distinguished personages. Every ticket of admission had been snatched up. A special place behind the table at which the 3 judges sat was set apart for the most distinguished and important of the man visitors. A row of armchairs had been placed there, something exceptional, which had never been allowed before. A large proportion, at less than half of the public, were ladies. There was such a large number of lawyers from all parts that they did not know where to seat them, for every ticket had long since been eagerly sought for and distributed. I saw at the end of the room, behind the platform, a special partition hurriedly put up, behind which all these lawyers were admitted, and they thought themselves lucky to have standing room there, for all chairs had been removed for the sake of space, and the crowd behind the partition stood throughout the case closely packed, shoulder to shoulder. Some of the ladies, especially those who came from a distance, made their appearance in the gallery very smartly dressed, but the majority of the ladies were oblivious even of dress. Their faces betrayed hysterical, intense, almost morbid curiosity. A peculiar fact established afterwards by many observations was that almost all the ladies, or at least the vast majority of them, were on Mitya's side and in favor of his being acquitted. This was perhaps chiefly owing to his reputation as a conqueror of female hearts. It was known that 2 women rivals were to appear in the case. One of them, Katerina Ivanovna, was an object of general interest. All sorts of extraordinary tales were told about her, amazing anecdotes of her passion for Mitya, in spite of his crime. Her pride and aristocratic connections were particularly insisted upon. She had called upon scarcely any one in the town. People said she intended to petition the government for leave to accompany the criminal to Siberia and to be married to him somewhere in the mines. The appearance of Grushenka in court was awaited with no less impatience. The public was looking forward with anxious curiosity to the meeting of the 2 rivals, the proud aristocratic girl and the hetaira. But Grushenka was a more familiar figure to the ladies of the district than Katerina Ivanovna. They had already seen the woman who had ruined Fyodor Pavlovich and his unhappy son, and all, almost without exception, wondered how father and son could be so in love with such a very common, ordinary Russian girl who was not even pretty. In brief, there was a great deal of talk. I know for a fact that there were several serious family quarrels on Mitya's account in our town. Many ladies quarreled violently with their husbands over differences of opinion about the dreadful case, and it was only natural that the husbands of these ladies, far from being favorably disposed to the prisoner, should enter the court bitterly prejudiced against him. In fact, one may say pretty certainly that the masculine, as distinguished from the feminine, part of the audience were biased against the prisoner. There were numbers of severe, frowning, even vindictive faces. Mitya, indeed, had managed to offend many people during his stay in the town. Some of the visitors were, of course, in excellent spirits and quite unconcerned as to the fate of Mitya personally, but all were interested in the trial, and the majority of the men were certainly hoping for the conviction of the criminal, except perhaps the lawyers, who were more interested in the legal than in the moral aspect of the case. Everybody was excited at the presence of the celebrated lawyer, Fyodor. His talent was well known, and this was not the first time he had defended notorious criminal cases in the provinces. And if he defended them, such cases became celebrated and long remembered all over Russia. There were stories, too, about our prosecutor and about the president of the court. It was said that Ippolit Kirillovich was in a tremor at meeting Fyodor, and that they had been enemies from the beginning of their careers in Petersburg. That though our sensitive prosecutor, who always considered that he had been aggrieved by someone in Petersburg because his talents had not been properly appreciated, was keenly excited over the Karamazov case, and was even dreaming of rebuilding his flagging fortunes by means of it. Fyodor, they said, was his one anxiety, but these rumors were not quite just. Our prosecutor was not one of those men who lose heart in face of danger. On the contrary, his self-confidence increased with the increase of danger. It must be noted that our prosecutor was in general too hasty and morbidly impressionable. He would put his whole soul into some case and work at it as though his whole fate and his whole fortune depended on its result. This was the subject of some ridicule in the legal world, for just by this characteristic our prosecutor had gained a wider notoriety than could have been expected from his modest position. People laughed particularly at his passion for psychology. In my opinion, they were wrong, and our prosecutor was, I believe, a character of greater depth than was generally supposed. But with his delicate health he had failed to make his mark at the outset of his career and had never made up for it later. As for the president of our court, I can only say that he was a humane and cultured man who had a practical knowledge of his work and progressive views. He was rather ambitious, but did not concern himself greatly about his future career. The great aim of his life was to be a man of advanced ideas. He was, too, a man of connections and property. He felt, as we learnt afterwards, rather strongly about the Karamazov case, but from a social, not from a personal standpoint. He was interested in it as a social phenomenon, in its classification and its character as a product of our social conditions, as typical of the national character, and so on, and so on. His attitude to the personal aspect of the case, to its tragic significance and the persons involved in it, including the prisoner, was rather indifferent and abstract, as was perhaps fitting, indeed. The court was packed and overflowing long before the judges made their appearance. Our court is the vast hall in the town, spacious, lofty, and good for sound. On the right of the judges, who were on a raised platform, a table and 2 rows of chairs had been put ready for the jury. On the left was the place for the prisoner and the counsel for the defense. In the middle of the court, near the judges, was a table with the material proofs. On it lay Fyodor Pavlovich's white silk dressing gown, stained with blood, the fatal breast parcel with which the supposed murder had been committed, Mitya's shirt with a blood-stained sleeve, his coat stained with blood in patches over the pocket in which he had put his handkerchief, the handkerchief itself stiff with blood and by now quite yellow, the pistol loaded by Mitya at Perotins with a view to suicide, and taken from him on the sly at Mokroe by Trifon Borisovich, the envelope in which the 3,000 rubles had been put ready for Grushenka, the narrow pink ribbon with which it had been tied, and many other articles I don't remember. In the body of the hall, at some distance, came the seats for the public, but in front of the balustrade a few chairs had been placed for witnesses who remained in the court after giving their evidence. At 10 o'clock the 3 judges arrived: the president, 1 honorary justice of the peace, and 1 other. The prosecutor, of course, entered immediately after. The president was a short, stout, thick-set man of 50, with a dyspeptic complexion, dark hair turning grey and cut short, and a red ribbon, of what order I don't remember. The prosecutor struck me and the others, too, as looking particularly pale, almost green. His face seemed to have grown suddenly thinner, perhaps in a single night, for I had seen him looking as usual only 2 days before. The president began with asking the court whether all the jury were present. But I see I can't go on like this, partly because some things I did not hear, others I did not notice, and others I have forgotten, but most of all because, as I have said before, I have literally no time or space to mention everything that was said and done. I only know that neither side objected to very many of the jurymen. I remember the 12 jurymen were petty officials of the town, 2 were merchants, and 6 peasants and artisans of the town. I remember, long before the trial, questions were continually asked with some surprise, especially by ladies. Can such a delicate, complex and psychological case be submitted for decision to petty officials and even peasants? And what can an official, still more a peasant, understand in such an affair? All the 4 officials in the jury were, in fact, men of no consequence and of low rank, except one who was rather younger. They were grey-headed men, little known in society, who had vegetated on a pitiful salary, and who probably had elderly, unpresentable wives and crowds of children, perhaps even without shoes and stockings. At most, they spent their leisure over cards and, of course, had never read a single book. The 2 merchants looked respectable, but were strangely silent and stolid. One of them was close-shaven and was dressed in European style. The other had a small, grey beard and wore a red ribbon with some sort of a medal upon it on his neck. There is no need to speak of the artisans and the peasants. The artisans of Skoto-Prigonievsk are almost peasants, and even work on the land. 2 of them also wore European dress, and, perhaps for that reason, were dirtier and more uninviting looking than the others. So that one might well wonder, as I did as soon as I had looked at them, what man like that could possibly make of such a case. Yet their faces made a strangely imposing, almost menacing, impression. They were stern and frowning. At last the president opened the case of the murderer of Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov. I don't quite remember how he described him. The court usher was told to bring in the prisoner, and Mitya made his appearance. There was a hush through the court. One could have heard a fly. I don't know how it was with others, but Mitya made a most unfavorable impression on me. He looked an awful dandy in a brand new frock-coat. I heard afterwards that he had ordered it in Moscow expressly for the occasion from his own tailor, who had his measure. He wore immaculate black kid gloves and exquisite linen. He walked in with his yard-long strides, looking stiffly straight in front of him, and sat down in his place with the most unperturbed air. At the same moment the counsel for defense, the celebrated Fyodor, entered, and a sort of subdued hum passed through the court. He was a tall, spare man, with long thin legs, with extremely long, thin, pale fingers, clean-shaven face, demurely brushed, rather short hair, and thin lips that were at times curved into something between a sneer and a smile. He looked about 40. His face would have been pleasant if it had not been for his eyes, which, in themselves small and inexpressive, were set remarkably close together, with only the thin, long nose as a dividing line between them. In fact, there was something strikingly bird-like about his face. He was in evening dress and white tie. I remember the president's first questions to Mitya about his name, his calling, and so on. Mitya answered sharply, and his voice was so unexpectedly loud that it made the president start and look at the prisoner with surprise. Then followed a list of persons who were to take part in the proceeding of the witnesses and experts. It was a long list, for of the witnesses were not present Masov, who had given evidence at the preliminary inquiry, but was now in Paris, Madame Holikov and Maximov, who were absent through illness, and Smerdyakov, through his sudden death, of which an official statement from the police was presented. The news of Smerdyakov's death produced a sudden stir and whisper in the court. Many of the audience, of course, had not heard of the sudden suicide. What struck people most was Mitya's sudden outburst. As soon as the statement of Smerdyakov's death was made, he cried out aloud from his place. He was a dog, and died like a dog. I remember how his counsel rushed to him, and how the president addressed him, threatening to take stern measures if such an irregularity were repeated. Mitya nodded and in a subdued voice repeated several times abruptly to his counsel, with no show of regret, "I won't again, I won't. It escaped me. I won't do it again." And, of course, this brief episode did him no good with the jury or the public. His character was displayed, and it spoke for itself. It was under the influence of this incident that the opening statement was read. It was rather short, but circumstantial. It only stated the chief reasons why he had been arrested, why he must be tried, and so on. Yet it made a great impression on me. The clerk read it loudly and distinctly. The whole tragedy was suddenly unfolded before us, concentrated, in bold relief, in a fatal and pitiless light. I remember how, immediately after it had been read, the president asked Mitya in a loud, impressive voice, "Prisoner, do you plead guilty?" Mitya suddenly rose from his seat. "I plead guilty to drunkenness and dissipation," he exclaimed, again in a startling, almost frenzied voice, "to idleness and debauchery. I meant to become an honest man for good, just at the moment when I was struck down by fate. But I am not guilty of the death of that old man, my enemy and my father. No, I am not guilty of robbing him. I could not be. Dmitri Karamazov is a scoundrel, but not a thief." He sat down again, visibly trembling all over. The president again briefly, but impressively, admonished him to answer only what was asked, and not to go off into irrelevant exclamations. Then he ordered the case to proceed. All the witnesses were led up to take the oath. Then I saw them all together. The brothers of the prisoner were, however, allowed to give evidence without taking the oath. After an exhortation from the priest and the president, the witnesses were led away and were made to sit as far as possible apart from one another. Then they began calling them out one by one. Chapter 2. Dangerous witnesses. I do not know whether the witnesses for the defense and for the prosecution were separated into groups by the president, and whether it was arranged to call them in a certain order, but no doubt it was so. I only know that the witnesses for the prosecution were called first. I repeat, I don't intend to describe all the questions step by step. Besides, my account would be to some extent superfluous, because in the speeches for the prosecution and for the defense the whole course of the evidence was brought together and set in a strong and significant light, and I took down parts of those two remarkable speeches in full, and will quote them in due course, together with one extraordinary and quite unexpected episode which occurred before the final speeches and undoubtedly influenced the sinister and fatal outcome of the trial. I will only observe that from the first moments of the trial one peculiar characteristic of the case was conspicuous and observed by all, that is, the overwhelming strength of the prosecution as compared with the arguments the defense had to rely upon. Everyone realized it from the first moment that the facts began to group themselves round a single point, and the whole horrible and bloody crime was gradually revealed. Everyone, perhaps, felt from the first that the case was beyond dispute, that there was no doubt about it, that there could be really no discussion, and that the defense was only a matter of form, and that the prisoner was guilty, obviously and conclusively guilty. I imagine that even the ladies, who were so impatiently longing for the acquittal of the interesting prisoner, were at the same time, without exception, convinced of his guilt. What's more, I believe they would have been mortified if his guilt had not been so firmly established, as that would have lessened the effect of the closing scene of the criminal's acquittal. That he would be acquitted, all the ladies, strange to say, were firmly persuaded up to the very last moment. He is guilty, but he will be acquitted from motives of humanity, in accordance with the new ideas, the new sentiments that had come into fashion, and so on and so on. And that was why they had crowded into the court so impatiently. The men were more interested in the contest between the prosecutor and the famous Fyodor. All were wondering and asking themselves what could even a talent like Fyodor's make of such a desperate case, and so they followed his achievements, step by step, with concentrated attention. But Fyodor remained an enigma to all up to the very end, up to his speech. Persons of experience suspected that he had some design, that he was working towards some object, but it was almost impossible to guess what it was. His confidence and self-reliance were unmistakable, however. Everyone noticed with pleasure, moreover, that he, after so short a stay, not more than 3 days, perhaps, among us, had so wonderfully succeeded in mastering the case and had studied it to a nicety. People described with relish, afterwards, how cleverly he had taken down all the witnesses for the prosecution and as far as possible perplexed them and, what's more, had aspersed their reputation and so depreciated the value of their evidence. But it was supposed that he did this rather by way of sport, so to speak, for professional glory, to show nothing had been omitted of the accepted methods, for all were convinced that he could do no real good by such disparagement of the witnesses, and probably was more aware of this than any one, having some idea of his own in the background, some concealed weapon of defense, which he would suddenly reveal when the time came. But meanwhile, conscious of his strength, he seemed to be diverting himself. So, for instance, when Gregory, Fyodor Pavlovich's old servant, who had given the most damning piece of evidence about the open door, was examined, the counsel for the defense positively fastened upon him when his turn came to question him. It must be noted that Gregory entered the hall with a composed and almost stately air, not the least disconcerted by the majesty of the court or the vast audience listening to him. He gave evidence with as much confidence as though he had been talking with his Martha, only perhaps more respectfully. It was impossible to make him contradict himself. The prosecutor questioned him first in detail about the family life of the Karamazovs. The family picture stood out in lurid colors. It was plain to ear and eye that the witness was guileless and impartial. In spite of his profound reverence for the memory of his deceased master, he yet bore witness that he had been unjust to Mitya and hadn't brought up his children as he should. Had have been devoured by lice when he was little, if it hadn't been for me, he added, describing Mitya's early childhood. It wasn't fair either of the father to wrong his son over his mother's property, which was by right his. In reply to the prosecutor's question what grounds he had for asserting that Fyodor Pavlovich had wronged his son in their money relations, Gregory, to the surprise of everyone, had no proof at all to bring forward, but he still persisted that the arrangement with the son was unfair, and that he ought to have paid him several thousand rubles more. I must note, by the way, that the prosecutor asked this question whether Fyodor Pavlovich had really kept back part of Mitya's inheritance with marked persistence of all the witnesses who could be asked it, not excepting Alyosha and Ivan. But he obtained no exact information from anyone. All alleged that it was so, but were unable to bring forward any distinct proof. Grigory's description of the scene at the dinner table, when Dmitri had burst in and beaten his father, threatening to come back to kill him, made a sinister impression on the court, especially as the old servant's composure in telling it. His parsimony of words and peculiar phraseology were as effective as eloquence. He observed that he was not angry with Mitya for having knocked him down and struck him on the face. He had forgiven him long ago, he said. Of the deceased Smerdyakov he observed, crossing himself, that he was a lad of ability, but stupid and afflicted, and, worse still, an infidel, and that it was Fyodor Pavlovich and his elder son who had taught him to be so. But he defended Smerdyakov's honesty almost with warmth, and related how Smerdyakov had once found the master's money in the yard, and, instead of concealing it, had taken it to his master, who had rewarded him with a gold piece for it, and trusted him implicitly from that time forward. He maintained obstinately that the door into the garden had been open, but he was asked so many questions that I can't recall them all. At last the counsel for the defense began to cross-examine him, and the first question he asked was about the envelope in which Fyodor Pavlovich was supposed to have put 3,000 rubles for a certain person. "Have you ever seen it, you?" who were for so many years in close attendance on your master?" Gregory answered that he had not seen it and had never heard of the money from anyone till everybody was talking about it. This question about the envelope Fyodor put to everyone who could conceivably have known of it as persistently as the prosecutor asked his question about Dimitri's inheritance, and got the same answer from all, that no one had seen the envelope, though many had heard of it. From the beginning everyone noticed Fyodorov's persistence on this subject. "Now, with your permission, I'll ask you a question," Fyodor said, suddenly and unexpectedly. "Of what was that balsam, or, rather, decoction, made, which, as we learn from the preliminary inquiry, you used on that evening to rub your lumbago, in the hope of curing it?" Gregory looked blankly at the questioner, and after a brief silence muttered, "There was saffron in it." "Nothing but saffron. Don't you remember any other ingredient?" "There was milfoil in it, too." "And pepper, perhaps?" Fyodor queried. "Yes, there was pepper, too, etc. And all dissolved in vodka, in spirit." There was a faint sound of laughter in the court. "You see, in spirit. After rubbing your back, I believe, you drank what was left in the bottle with a certain pious prayer, only known to your wife." "I did." "Did you drink much? Roughly speaking, a wineglass or two?" "It might have been a tumblerful." "A tumblerful, even, perhaps a tumbler and a half." Gregory did not answer. He seemed to see what was meant. A glass and a half of neat spirit is not at all bad, don't you think? You might see the gates of heaven open, not only the door into the garden. Gregory remained silent. There was another laugh in the court. The president made a movement. "Do you know for a fact," Fyodor persisted, "whether you were awake or not when you saw the open door?" "I was on my legs." "That's not a proof that you were awake." There was again laughter in the court. "Could you have answered at that moment, if anyone had asked you a question, for instance, what year it is?" "I don't know." "And what year is it, Anno Domini? Do you know?" Gregory stood with a perplexed face, looking straight at his tormentor. Strange to say, it appeared he really did not know what year it was. "But perhaps you can tell me how many fingers you have on your hands." "I am a servant," Gregory said suddenly, in a loud and distinct voice. "If my betters think fit to make game of me, it is my duty to suffer it." Fyodor was a little taken aback, and the president intervened, reminding him that he must ask more relevant questions. Fyodor bowed with dignity and said that he had no more questions to ask of the witness. The public and the jury, of course, were left with a grain of doubt in their minds as to the evidence of a man who might, while undergoing a certain cure, have seen the gates of heaven, and who did not even know what year he was living in. But before Gregory left the box, another episode occurred. The president, turning to the prisoner, asked him whether he had any comment to make on the evidence of the last witness. "Except about the door, all he has said is true," cried Mitya in a loud voice. "For combing the lice off me, I thank him. For forgiving my blows, I thank him. The old man has been honest all his life, and as faithful to my father as 700 poodles." "Prisoner, be careful in your language," the president admonished him. "I am not a poodle," Gregory muttered. "All right, I'm a poodle myself," cried Mitya. "If it's an insult, I take it to myself, and I beg his pardon. I was a beast and cruel to him. I was cruel to Sop too." "What Sop?" the president asked sternly again. "Oh, Pirate, my father, Fyodor Pavlovich." The president again and again warned Mitya impressively and very sternly to be more careful in his language. "You are injuring yourself in the opinion of your judges." The counsel for the defense was equally clever in dealing with the evidence of Rakitin. I may remark that Rakitin was one of the leading witnesses and one to whom the prosecutor attached great significance. It appeared that he knew everything. His knowledge was amazing. He had been everywhere, seen everything, talked to everybody, knew every detail of the biography of Fyodor Pavlovich and all the Karamazovs. Of the envelope, it is true, he had only heard from Mitya himself, but he described minutely Mitya's exploits in the metropolis, all his compromising doings and sayings. and told the story of Captain Snadriev's wisp of tow. But even Rakitin could say nothing positive about Mitya's inheritance and confined himself to contemptuous generalities. Who could tell which of them was to blame and which was in debt to the other, with their crazy Karamazov way of muddling things so that no one could make head or tail of it? He attributed the tragic crime to the habits that had become ingrained by ages of serfdom and the distressed condition of Russia due to the lack of appropriate institutions. He was, in fact, allowed some latitude of speech. This was the first occasion on which Rakitin showed what he could do and attracted notice. The prosecutor knew that the witness was preparing a magazine article on the case, and afterwards in his speech, as we shall see later, quoted some ideas from the article, showing that he had seen it already. The picture drawn by the witness was a gloomy and sinister one, and greatly strengthened the case for the prosecution. Altogether, Rakitin's discourse fascinated the public by its independence and the extraordinary nobility of its ideas. There were even 2 or 3 outbreaks of applause when he spoke of serfdom and the distressed condition of Russia. But Rakitin, in his youthful ardor, made a slight blunder, of which the counsel for the defense at once adroitly took advantage. Answering certain questions about Grushenka, and carried away by the loftiness of his own sentiments and his success, of which he was, of course, conscious, he went so far as to speak somewhat contemptuously of Agrafena Alexandrovna as the capped mistress of Samsonov. He would have given a good deal to take back his words afterwards, for Fyodor caught him out over it at once. And it was all because Rakitin had not reckoned on the lawyer having been able to become so intimately acquainted with every detail in so short a time. "Allow me to ask," began the counsel for the defense with the most affable and even respectful smile. "You are, of course, the same Mr. Rakitin whose pamphlet, The Life of the Deceased Elder, Father Zosima, published by the diocesan authorities, full of profound and religious reflections and preceded by an excellent and devout dedication to the bishop, I have just read with such pleasure. I did not write it for publication. It was published afterwards," muttered Rakitin, for some reason fearfully disconcerted and almost ashamed. "Oh, that's excellent. A thinker like you can, and indeed ought to, take the widest view of every social question. Your most instructive pamphlet has been widely circulated through the patronage of the bishop, and has been of appreciable service. But this is the chief thing I should like to learn from you. You stated just now that you were very intimately acquainted with Madame Svyatlov. It must be noted that Grushenka's surname was Svyatlov. I heard it for the first time that day, during the case. I cannot answer for all my acquaintances. I am a young man, and who can be responsible for every one he meets," cried Rakitin, flushing all over. "I understand, I quite understand," cried Fyodor, as though he, too, were embarrassed and in haste to excuse himself. "You, like any other, might well be interested in an acquaintance with a young and beautiful woman who would readily entertain the light of the youth of the neighborhood. But I only wanted to know. It has come to my knowledge that Madame Svyatlov was particularly anxious a couple of months ago to make the acquaintance of the younger Karamazov, Alexei Fyodorovich, and promised you 25 rubles if you would bring him to her in his monastic dress. And that actually took place on the evening of the day on which the terrible crime, which is the subject of the present investigation, was committed. You brought Alexei Karamazov to Madame Svyatlov, and did you receive the 25 rubles from Madame Svyatlov as a reward? That's what I wanted to hear from you. It was a joke. I don't see of what interest that can be to you. I took it for a joke, meaning to give it back later. Then you did take, but you have not given it back yet. Or have you? That's of no consequence, muttered Rakitin. I refuse to answer such questions. Of course I shall give it back. The president intervened, but Fyodor declared he had no more questions to ask of the witness. Mr. Rakitin left the witness box not absolutely without a stain upon his character. The effect left by the lofty idealism of his speech was somewhat marred, and Fyodor's expression, as he watched him walk away, seemed to suggest to the public this is a specimen of the lofty-minded persons who accuse him. I remember that this incident, too, did not pass off without an outbreak from Mitya. Enraged by the tone in which Rakitin had referred to Grushenka, he suddenly shouted Bernard. When, after Rakitin's cross-examination, the president asked the prisoner if he had anything to say, Mitya cried loudly, "Since I've been arrested, he has borrowed money from me. He is a contemptible Bernard and opportunist, and he doesn't believe in God. He took the bishop in." Mitya, of course, was pulled up again for the intemperance of his language, but Rakitin was done for. Captain Snedryov's evidence was a failure, too, but from quite a different reason. He appeared in ragged and dirty clothes, muddy boots, and in spite of the vigilance and expert observation of the police officers, he turned out to be hopelessly drunk. On being asked about Mitya's attack upon him, he refused to answer. "God bless him. Ilusha told me not to. God will make it up to me yonder. Who told you not to tell? Of whom are you talking?" "Ilusha, my little son. Father, father, how he insulted you. He said that at the stone. Now he is dying." The captain suddenly began sobbing and plumped down on his knees before the president. He was hurriedly led away amidst the laughter of the public. The effect prepared by the prosecutor did not come off at all. Fyodor went on making the most of every opportunity and amazed people more and more by his minute knowledge of the case. Thus, for example, Trifon Borisovich made a great impression, of course, very prejudicial to Mitya. He calculated almost on his fingers that on his first visit to Mokroe, Mitya must have spent 3,000 rubles, or very little less. Just think what he squandered on those gypsy girls alone. And as for our lousy peasants, it wasn't a case of flinging half a ruble in the street. He made them presents of 25 rubles each, at least. He didn't give them less. And what a lot of money was simply stolen from him. And if anyone did steal, he did not leave a receipt. How could one catch the thief when he was flinging his money away all the time? Our peasants are robbers, you know, they have no care for their souls. And the way he went on with the girls, our village girls, they're completely set up since then. I tell you, they used to be poor. He recalled, in fact, every item of expense and added it all up. So the theory that only 1,500 had been spent and the rest had been put aside in a little bag seemed inconceivable. I saw 3,000 as clear as a penny in his hands. I saw it with my own eyes. I should think I ought to know how to reckon money, cried Trifon Borisovich, doing his best to satisfy his betters. When Fyodor had to cross-examine him, he scarcely tried to refute his evidence, but began asking him about an incident at the first carousal at Mokroe, a month before the arrest, when Timothy and another peasant called Akim had picked up on the floor in the passage 100 rubles dropped by Mitya when he was drunk, and had given them to Trifon Borisovich and received a ruble each from him for doing so. "Well," asked the lawyer, "did you give that 100 rubles back to Mr. Karamazov?" Trifon Borisovich shuffled in vain. He was obliged, after the peasants had been examined, to admit the finding of the 100 rubles, only adding that he had religiously returned it all to Dmitri Fyodorovich in perfect honesty, and it's only because his honor was in liquor at the time. He wouldn't remember it. But, as he had denied the incident of the 100 rubles till the peasants had been called to prove it, his evidence as to returning the money to Mitya was naturally regarded with great suspicion. So one of the most dangerous witnesses brought forward by the prosecution was again discredited. The same thing happened with the Poles. They took up an attitude of pride and independence. They vociferated loudly that they had both been in the service of the crown, and that Pan Mitya had offered them 3,000 to buy their honor, and that they had seen a large sum of money in his hands. Pan Masyalovich introduced a terrible number of Polish words into his sentences, and seeing that this only increased his consequence in the eyes of the president and the prosecutor, grew more and more pompous, and ended by talking in Polish altogether. But Fyodor caught them, too, in his snares. Trifon Borisovich, recalled, was forced, in spite of his evasions, to admit that Pen Wróblewski had substituted another pack of cards for the one he had provided, and that Pan Maciolowicz had cheated during the game. Kalganov confirmed this, and both the Poles left the witness box with damaged reputations amidst laughter from the public. Then exactly the same thing happened with almost all the most dangerous witnesses. Fyodor succeeded in casting a slur on all of them and dismissing them with a certain derision. The lawyers and experts were lost in admiration and were only at a loss to understand what good purpose could be served by it, for all, I repeat, felt that the case for the prosecution could not be refuted, but was growing more and more tragically overwhelming. But from the confidence of the great magician they saw that he was serene, and they waited, feeling that such a man had not come from Petersburg for nothing, and that he was not a man to return unsuccessful. Chapter 3. The medical experts and a pound of nuts. The evidence of the medical experts, too, was of little use to the prisoner, and it appeared later that Fyodor had not reckoned much upon it. The medical line of defense had only been taken up through the insistence of Katerina Ivanovna, who had sent for a celebrated doctor from Moscow on purpose. The case for the defense could, of course, lose nothing by it and might, with luck, gain something from it. There was, however, an element of comedy about it, through the difference of opinion of the doctors. The medical experts were the famous doctor from Moscow, our doctor, Hazenstub, and the young doctor, Varvinsky. The two latter appeared also as witnesses for the prosecution. The first to be called in the capacity of expert was Dr. Hazenstub. He was a grey and bald old man of 70, of middle height and sturdy build. He was much esteemed and respected by everyone in the town. He was a conscientious doctor and an excellent and pious man, a Hunguto or Moravian brother. I am not quite sure which. He had been living amongst us for many years and behaved with wonderful dignity. He was a kind-hearted and humane man. He treated the sick poor and peasants for nothing, visited them in their slums and huts, and left money for medicine, but he was as obstinate as a mule. If once he had taken an idea into his head, there was no shaking it. Almost everyone in the town was aware, by the way, that the famous doctor had, within the first 2 or 3 days of his presence among us, uttered some extremely offensive allusions to Dr. Hazenstub's qualifications. Though the Moscow doctor asked 25 rubles for a visit, several people in the town were glad to take advantage of his arrival and rushed to consult him regardless of expense. All these had, of course, been previously patients of Dr. Hazenstub, and the celebrated doctor had criticized his treatment with extreme harshness. Finally, he had asked the patients as soon as he saw them, "Well, who has been cramming you with nostrums?" Hazenstub. He, Dr. Hazenstub, of course, heard all this, and now all the 3 doctors made their appearance, one after another, to be examined. Dr. Hazenstub roundly declared that the abnormality of the prisoner's mental faculties was self-evident. Then, giving his grounds for this opinion, which I omit here, he added that the abnormality was not only evident in many of the prisoner's actions in the past, but was apparent even now at this very moment. When he was asked to explain how it was apparent now at this moment, the old doctor, with simple-hearted directness, pointed out that the prisoner on entering the court had an extraordinary air, remarkable in the circumstances, that he had marched in like a soldier, looking straight before him, though it would have been more natural for him to look to the left where, among the public, the ladies were sitting. Seeing that he was a great admirer of the fair sex and must be thinking much of what the ladies are saying of him now, the old man concluded in his peculiar language. I must add that he spoke Russian readily, but every phrase was formed in German style, which did not, however, trouble him, for it had always been a weakness of his to believe that he spoke Russian perfectly, better indeed than Russians, and he was very fond of using Russian proverbs, always declaring that the Russian proverbs were the best and most expressive sayings in the whole world. I may remark, too, that in conversation, through absent-mindedness, he often forgot the most ordinary words, which sometimes went out of his head, though he knew them perfectly. The same thing happened, though, when he spoke German, and at such times he always waved his hand before his face as though trying to catch the lost word, and no one could induce him to go on speaking till he had found the missing word. His remark that the prisoner ought to have looked at the ladies on entering roused a whisper of amusement in the audience. All our ladies were very fond of our old doctor. They knew, too, that having been all his life a bachelor and a religious man of exemplary conduct, he looked upon women as lofty creatures, and so his unexpected observation struck every one as very queer. The Moscow doctor, being questioned in his turn, definitely and emphatically repeated that he considered the prisoner's mental condition abnormal in the highest degree. He talked at length and with erudition of aberration and mania, and argued that, from all the facts collected, the prisoner had undoubtedly been in a condition of aberration for several days before his arrest, and, if the crime had been committed by him, it must, even if he were conscious of it, have been almost involuntary, as he had not the power to control the morbid impulse that possessed him. But apart from temporary aberration, the doctor diagnosed mania, which premised, in his words, to lead to complete insanity in the future. It must be noted that I report this in my own words. The doctor made use of very learned and professional language. All his actions are in contravention of common sense and logic, he continued. Not to refer to what I have not seen, that is, the crime itself and the whole catastrophe, the day before yesterday, while he was talking to me, he had an unaccountably fixed look in his eye. He laughed unexpectedly when there was nothing to laugh at. He showed continual and inexplicable irritability, using strange words, Bernard, ethics, and others equally inappropriate. But the doctor detected mania, above all, in the fact that the prisoner could not even speak of the 3,000 rubles, of which he considered himself to have been cheated, without extraordinary irritation, though he could speak comparatively lightly of other misfortunes and grievances. According to all accounts, he had even in the past, whenever the subject of the 3,000 rubles was touched on, flown into a perfect frenzy, and yet he was reported to be a disinterested and not grasping man. As to the opinion of my learned colleague, the Moscow doctor added ironically in conclusion that the prisoner would, on entering the court, have naturally looked at the ladies and not straight before him. I will only say that, apart from the playfulness of this theory, it is radically unsound, for though I fully agree that the prisoner, on entering the court where his fate will be decided, would not naturally look straight before him in that fixed way, and that may really be a sign of his abnormal mental condition. At the same time, I maintain that he would naturally not look to the left at the ladies, but, on the contrary, to the right to find his legal adviser, on whose help all his hopes rest and on whose defense all his future depends. The doctor expressed his opinion positively and emphatically, but the unexpected pronouncement of Dr. Varvinsky gave the last touch of comedy to the difference of opinion between the experts. In his opinion, the prisoner was now, and had been all along, in a perfectly normal condition, and, although he certainly must have been in a nervous and exceedingly excited state before his arrest, this might have been due to several perfectly obvious causes: jealousy, anger, continual drunkenness, and so on. But this nervous condition would not involve the mental aberration of which mention had just been made. As to the question whether the prisoner should have looked to the left or to the right on entering the court, in his modest opinion, the prisoner would naturally look straight before him on entering the court, as he had in fact done, as that was where the judges, on whom his fate depended, were sitting, so that it was just by looking straight before him that he showed his perfectly normal state of mind at the present. The young doctor concluded his modest testimony with some heat. "Bravo, doctor," cried Mitya from his seat. Just so. Mitya, of course, was checked, but the young doctor's opinion had a decisive influence on the judges and on the public, and, as appeared afterwards, everyone agreed with him. But Dr. Hazenstub, when called as a witness, was quite unexpectedly of use to Mitya. As an old resident in the town who had known the Karamazov family for years, he furnished some facts of great value for the prosecution, and suddenly, As though recalling something, he added, "But the poor young man might have had a very different life, for he had a good heart both in childhood and after childhood, that I know. But the Russian proverb says, if a man has one head, it's good, but if another clever man comes to visit him, it would be better still, for then there will be two heads and not only one. One head is good, but to a better," the prosecutor put in impatiently. He knew the old man's habit of talking slowly and deliberately, regardless of the impression he was making and of the delay he was causing, and highly prizing his flat, dull, and always gleefully complacent German wit. The old man was fond of making jokes. "Oh, yes, that's what I say," he went on stubbornly. "One head is good, but to a much better." But he did not meet another head with wits, and his wits went. Where did they go? I've forgotten the word. He went on, passing his hand before his eyes. "Oh, yes, Spasieren. Wandering. Oh, yes, wandering. That's what I say." Well, his wits went wandering and fell in such a deep hole that he lost himself. And yet he was a grateful and sensitive boy. Oh, I remember him very well. A little chap so high, left neglected by his father in the backyard when he ran about without boots on his feet, and his little breeches hanging by one button. A note of feeling and tenderness suddenly came into the honest old man's voice. Fyodor positively started, as though scenting something, and caught at it instantly. "Oh, yes, I was a young man then. I was. Well, I was 45 then, and had only just come here, and I was so sorry for the boy then. I asked myself why shouldn't I buy him a pound of what? I've forgotten what it's called. A pound of what children are very fond of. What is it? What is it?" The doctor began waving his hands again. "It grows on a tree and is gathered and given to everyone. Apples." "Oh, no, no. You have a dozen of apples, not a pound." "No, there are a lot of them, and all little. You put them in the mouth and crack." "Nuts?" "Quite so, nuts. I say so." The doctor repeated in the calmest way as though he had been at no loss for a word. "And I bought him a pound of nuts, for no one had ever bought the boy a pound of nuts before. And I lifted my finger and said to him, 'Boy, Gott der Vater.' He laughed and said, 'Gott der Vater, Gott der Son.' He laughed again and lisped, 'Gott der Son, Gott der Heiliggeist.' Then he laughed and said as best he could, 'Gott der Heiliggeist.' I went away, and 2 days after I happened to be passing, and he shouted to me of himself, 'Uncle, Gott der Vater, Gott der Son,' and he had only forgotten Gott der Heiliggeist. But I reminded him of it, and I felt very sorry for him again. But he was taken away, and I did not see him again. 23 years passed. I am sitting one morning in my study, a white-haired old man, when there walks into the room a blooming young man, whom I should never have recognized, but he held up his finger and said, laughing, 'Gott der Vater, Gott der Son, and Gott der Heiliggeist. I have just arrived and have come to thank you for that pound of nuts, for no one else ever bought me a pound of nuts. You are the only one that ever did.' And then I remembered my happy youth and the poor child in the yard, without boots on his feet, and my heart was touched, and I said, 'You are a grateful young man, for you have remembered all your life the pound of nuts I bought you in your childhood.' And I embraced him and blessed him, and I shed tears." He laughed, but he shed tears too, for the Russian often laughs when he ought to be weeping. But he did weep. I saw it, and now, alas, and I am weeping now. German, I am weeping now, too. You saintly men, Mitya cried suddenly. In any case, the anecdote made a certain favorable impression on the public. But the chief sensation in Mitya's favor was created by the evidence of Katerina Ivanovna, which I will describe directly. Indeed, when the witnesses de charge, that is, called by the defense, began giving evidence, fortune seemed all at once markedly more favorable to Mitya, and what was particularly striking, this was a surprise even to the counsel for the defense. But before Katerina Ivanovna was called, Alyosha was examined, and he recalled a fact which seemed to furnish positive evidence against one important point made by the prosecution. Chapter 4. Fortune smiles on Mitya. It came quite as a surprise even to Alyosha himself. He was not required to take the oath, and I remember that both sides addressed him very gently and sympathetically. It was evident that his reputation for goodness had preceded him. Alyosha gave his evidence modestly and with restraint, but his warm sympathy for his unhappy brother was unmistakable. In answer to one question, he sketched his brother's character as that of a man, violent-tempered perhaps and carried away by his passions, but at the same time honorable, proud and generous, capable of self-sacrifice if necessary. He admitted, however, that, through his passion for Grushenka and his rivalry with his father, his brother had been of late in an intolerable position, but he repelled with indignation the suggestion that his brother might have committed a murder for the sake of gain, though he recognized that the 3,000 rubles had become almost an obsession with Mitya, that he looked upon them as part of the inheritance he had been cheated of by his father, and that, indifferent as he was to money as a rule, he could not even speak of that 3,000 without fury. As for the rivalry of the two ladies, as the prosecutor expressed it is, of Grushenka and Kotya, he answered evasively and was even unwilling to answer one or two questions altogether. Did your brother tell you, anyway, that he intended to kill your father? Asked the prosecutor. You can refuse to answer if you think necessary, he added. He did not tell me so directly, answered Alyosha. How so? Did he indirectly? He spoke to me once of his hatred for our father and his fear that at an extreme moment, at a moment of fury, he might perhaps murder him. And you believed him? I am afraid to say that I did. But I never doubted that some higher feeling would always save him at the fatal moment, as it has indeed saved him. For it was not he killed my father, Alyosha said firmly in a loud voice that was heard throughout the court. The prosecutor started like a war horse at the sound of a trumpet. Let me assure you that I fully believe in the complete sincerity of your conviction and do not explain it by or identify it with your affection for your unhappy brother. Your peculiar view of the whole tragic episode is known to us already from the preliminary investigation. I won't attempt to conceal from you that it is highly individual and contradicts all the other evidence collected by the prosecution. And so I think it essential to press you to tell me what facts have led you to this conviction of your brother's innocence and of the guilt of another person against whom you gave evidence at the preliminary inquiry. I only answered the questions asked me at the preliminary inquiry, replied Alyosha, slowly and calmly. I made no accusation against Smerdyakov of myself, yet you gave evidence against him. I was led to do so by my brother Dmitri's words. I was told what took place at his arrest and how he had pointed to Smerdyakov before I was examined. I believe absolutely that my brother is innocent, and if he didn't commit the murder, then Smerdyakov. Why Smerdyakov? And why are you so completely persuaded of your brother's innocence? I cannot help believing my brother. I know he wouldn't lie to me. I saw from his face he wasn't lying, only from his face. Is that all the proof you have? I have no other proof. And of Smerdyakov's guilt you have no proof whatever but your brother's word and the expression of his face. No, I have no other proof. The prosecutor dropped the examination at this point. The impression left by Alyosha's evidence on the public was most disappointing. There had been talk about Smerdyakov before the trial. Someone had heard something. Someone had pointed out something else. It was said that Alyosha had gathered together some extraordinary proofs of his brother's innocence and Smerdyakov's guilt. And after all there was nothing. No evidence except certain moral convictions so natural in a brother. But Fyodor began his cross-examination. On his asking Alyosha when it was that the prisoner had told him of his hatred for his father and that he might kill him, and whether he had heard it. For instance, at their last meeting before the catastrophe, Alyosha started as he answered, as though only just recollecting and understanding something. I remember one circumstance now which had quite forgotten myself. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but now, and obviously only now for the first time struck by an idea. He recounted eagerly how, at his last interview with Mitya that evening under the tree, on the road to the monastery, Mitya had struck himself on the breast. the upper part of the breast, and had repeated several times that he had a means of regaining his honor, that means was here on his breast. I thought, when he struck himself on the breast, he meant that it was in his heart. Alyosha continued that he might find in his heart strength to save himself from some awful disgrace which was awaiting him and which he did not dare confess even to me. I must confess I did think at the time that he was speaking of our father, and that the disgrace he was shuddering at was the thought of going to our father and doing some violence to him. Yet it was just then that he pointed to something on his breast, so that I remember the idea struck me at the time that the heart is not on that part of the breast, but below, and that he struck himself much too high, just below the neck, and kept pointing to that place. My idea seemed silly to me at the time, but he was perhaps pointing then to that little bag in which he had 1,500 rubles. Just so, Mitya cried from his place. That's right, Alyosha, it was the little bag I struck with my fist. Fyodor flew to him in hot haste, entreating him to keep quiet, and at the same instant pounced on Alyosha. Alyosha, carried away himself by his recollection, warmly expressed his theory that this disgrace was probably just that 1,500 rubles on him, which he might have returned to Katerina Ivanovna as half of what he owed her, but which he had yet determined not to repay her and to use for another prepossessumly to enable him to elope with Grushenka, if she consented. It is so, it must be so, exclaimed Alyosha in sudden excitement. My brother cried several times that half of the disgrace, half of it, he said half several times, he could free himself from at once, but that he was so unhappy in his weakness of will that he wouldn't do it, that he knew beforehand he was incapable of doing it. And you clearly, confidently remember that he struck himself just on this part of the breast? Fyodor asked eagerly. Clearly and confidently, for I thought at the time, why does he strike himself up there when the heart is lower down? And the thought seemed stupid to me at the time. I remember it seeming stupid. It flashed through my mind. That's what brought it back to me just now. How could I have forgotten it till now? It was that little bag he meant when he said he had the means but wouldn't give back that 1,500. And when he was arrested at Mokra he cried, "Duty no." I was told if it, he considered it the most disgraceful act of his life that when he had the means of repaying Katerina Ivanovna half note, what he owed her, he yet could not bring himself to repay the money and preferred to remain a thief in her eyes rather than part with it. And what torture that debt has been to him, Alyosha exclaimed in conclusion. The prosecutor, of course, intervened. He asked Alyosha to describe once more how it had all happened, and several times insisted on the question, had the prisoner seemed to point to anything. Perhaps he had simply struck himself with his fist on the breast, but it was not with his fist, cried Alyosha. He pointed with his fingers, and pointed here, very high up. How could I have so completely forgotten it till this moment? The president asked Mitya what he had to say to the last witness evidence. Mitya confirmed it, saying that he had been pointing to the 1,500 rubles which were on his breast, just below the neck, and that was, of course, a disgrace I cannot deny. The most shameful act of my whole life, cried Mitya. I might have repaid it and didn't repay it. I preferred to remain a thief in her eyes rather than give it back. And the most shameful part of it was that I knew beforehand I shouldn't give it back. You are right, Alyosha. Thanks, Alyosha. So Alyosha's cross-examination ended. What was important and striking about it was that one fact at least had been found. And even though this were only one tiny bit of evidence, a mere hint at evidence, it did go some little way towards proving that the bag had existed and had contained 1,500 rubles, and that the prisoner had not been lying at the preliminary inquiry when he alleged at Mokro that those 1,500 rubles were his own. Alyosha was glad. With a flushed face, he moved away to the seat assigned to him. He kept repeating to himself, how was it I forgot? How could I have forgotten it? And what made it come back to me now? Katerina Ivanovna was called to the witness box. As she entered, something extraordinary happened in the court. The ladies clutched their lorgnettes and opera glasses. There was a stir among the men. Some stood up to get a better view. Everybody alleged afterwards that Mitya had turned white as a sheet on her entrance. All in black, she advanced modestly, almost timidly. It was impossible to tell from her face that she was agitated, but there was a resolute gleam in her dark and gloomy eyes. I may remark that many people mentioned that she looked particularly handsome at that moment. She spoke softly but clearly, so that she was heard all over the court. She expressed herself with composure, or at least tried to appear composed. The president began his examination discreetly and very respectfully, as though afraid to touch on certain chords and showing consideration for her great unhappiness. But in answer to one of the first questions, Katerina Ivanovna replied firmly that she had been formerly betrothed to the prisoner until he left me of his own accord. She added quietly, when they asked her about the 3,000 she had entrusted to Mitya to post to her relations, she said firmly, "I didn't give him the money simply to send it off. I felt at the time that he was in great need of money. I gave him the 3,000 on the understanding that he should post it within the month if he cared to. There was no need for him to worry himself about that debt afterwards." I will not repeat all the questions asked her and all her answers in detail. I will only give the substance of her evidence. I was firmly convinced that he would send off that sum as soon as he got money from his father. She went on, "I have never doubted his disinterestedness and his honesty, his scrupulous honesty, in money matters. He felt quite certain that he would receive the money from his father and spoke to me several times about it. I knew he had a feud with his father and have always believed that he had been unfairly treated by his father. I don't remember any threat uttered by him against his father. He certainly never uttered any such threat before me. If he had come to me at that time, I should have at once relieved his anxiety about that unlucky 3,000 rubles, but he had given up coming to see me, and I myself was put in such a position that I could not invite him, and I had no right, indeed, to be exacting as to that money." She added suddenly, and there was a ring of resolution in her voice, "I was once indebted to him for assistance in money for more than 3,000, and I took it, although I could not at that time foresee that I should ever be in a position to repay my debt." There was a note of defiance in her voice. It was then Fyodor began his cross-examination. "Did that take place not here, but at the beginning of your acquaintance?" Fyodor suggested cautiously, feeling his way, instantly scenting something favorable. I must mention in parenthesis that, though Fyodor had been brought from Petersburg partly at the instance of Katerina Ivanovna herself, he knew nothing about the episode of the 4,000 rubles given her by Mitya and of her bowing to the ground to him. She concealed this from him and said nothing about it, and that was strange. It may be pretty certainly assumed that she herself did not know till the very last minute whether she would speak of that episode in the court, and waited for the inspiration of the moment. No, I can never forget those moments. She began telling her story. She told everything, the whole episode that Mitya had told Alyosha, and her bowing to the ground, and her reason. She told about her father and her going to Mitya, and did not in one word, in a single hint, suggest that Mitya had himself, through her sister, proposed they should send him Katerina Ivanovna to fetch the money. She generously concealed that and was not ashamed to make it appear as though she had of her own impulse run to the young officer, relying on something, to beg him for the money. It was something tremendous. I turned cold and trembled as I listened. The court was hushed, trying to catch each word. It was something unexampled, even from such a self-willed and contemptuously proud girl as she was, such an extremely frank avowal, such sacrifice, such self-immolation seemed incredible. And for what? For whom? To save the man who had deceived and insulted her, and to help, in however small a degree, in saving him by creating a strong impression in his favor. And, indeed, the figure of the young officer who, with a respectful bow to the innocent girl, handed her his last 4,000 rubles, all he had in the world, was thrown into a very sympathetic and attractive light. But I had a painful misgiving at heart. I felt that calumny might come of it later, and it did. In fact, it did. It was repeated all over the town afterwards with spiteful laughter that the story was perhaps not quite complete as it is. In the statement that the officer had let the young lady depart with nothing but a respectful bow, it was hinted that something was here omitted. And even if nothing had been omitted, if this were the whole story, the most highly respected of our ladies maintained, even then it's very doubtful whether it was creditable for a young girl to behave in that way, even for the sake of saving her father. And can Katerina Ivanovna, with her intelligence, her morbid sensitiveness, have failed to understand that people would talk like that? She must have understood it, yet she made up her mind to tell everything. Of course, all these nasty little suspicions as to the truth of her story only arose afterwards, and at the first moment all were deeply impressed by it. As for the judges and the lawyers, they listened in reverent, almost shamefaced silence to Katerina Ivanovna. The prosecutor did not venture upon even one question on the subject. Fyodor made a low bow to her. Oh, he was almost triumphant. Much ground had been gained. For a man to give his last 4,000 on a generous impulse, and then for the same man to murder his father for the sake of robbing him of 3,000th idea seemed too incongruous. Fyodor felt that now the charge of theft, at least, was as good as disproved. The case was thrown into quite a different light. There was a wave of sympathy for Mitya. As for him, I was told that once or twice, while Katerina Ivanovna was giving her evidence, he jumped up from his seat, sank back again, and hid his face in his hands. But when she had finished, he suddenly cried in a sobbing voice, "Kotya, why have you ruined me?" And his sobs were audible all over the court. But he instantly restrained himself and cried again, "Now I am condemned." Then he sat rigid in his place, with his teeth clenched and his arms across his chest. Katerina Ivanovna remained in the court and sat down in her place. She was pale and sat with her eyes cast down. Those who were sitting near her declared that for a long time she shivered all over as though in a fever. Grushenka was called. I am approaching the sudden catastrophe which was perhaps the final cause of Mitya's ruin. For I am convinced, so is every Arnold, the lawyers said the same afterwards, that if the episode had not occurred, the prisoner would at least have been recommended to mercy. But of that later. A few words first about Grushenka. She, too, was dressed entirely in black, with her magnificent black shawl on her shoulders. She walked to the witness box with her smooth, noiseless tread, with the slightly swaying gait common in women of full figure. She looked steadily at the president, turning her eyes neither to the right nor to the left. To my thinking, she looked very handsome at that moment, and not at all pale, as the ladies alleged afterwards. They declared, too, that she had a concentrated and spiteful expression. I believe that she was simply irritated and painfully conscious of the contemptuous and inquisitive eyes of our scandal-loving public. She was proud and could not stand contempt. She was one of those people who flare up, angry and eager to retaliate at the mere suggestion of contempt. There was an element of timidity, too, of course, and inward shame at her own timidity, so it was not strange that her tone kept changing. At one moment it was angry, contemptuous, and rough, and at another there was a sincere note of self-condemnation. Sometimes she spoke as though she were taking a desperate plunge, as though she felt, "I don't care what happens, he'll say it." Apropos of her acquaintance with Fyodor Pavlovich, she remarked curtly, "That's all nonsense, and was it my fault that he would pass to me?" But a minute later she added, "It was all my fault. I was laughing at them both, at the old man and at him, too, and I brought both of them to this. It was all on account of me it happened. Samsonov's name came up somehow. That's nobody's business," she snapped at once, with a sort of insolent defiance. "He was my benefactor. He took me when I hadn't a shoe to my foot, when my family had turned me out." The president reminded her, though very politely, that she must answer the questions directly, without going off into irrelevant details. Grushenka crimsoned and her eyes flashed. The envelope with the notes in it she had not seen, but had only heard from that wicked wretch that Fyodor Pavlovich had an envelope with notes for 3,000 in it. But that was all foolishness. I was only laughing. I wouldn't have gone to him for anything. "To whom are you referring as that wicked wretch?" inquired the prosecutor. "The lackey, Smerdyakov. who murdered his master and hanged himself last night. She was, of course, at once asked what ground she had for such a definite accusation, but it appeared that she, too, had no grounds for it. Dmitri Fyodorovich told me so himself. You can believe him. The woman who came between us has ruined him. She is the cause of it all, let me tell you, Grushenka added. She seemed to be quivering with hatred, and there was a vindictive note in her voice. She was again asked to whom she was referring. The young lady, Katerina Ivanovna there. She sent for me, offered me chocolate, tried to fascinate me. There's not much true shame about her, I can tell you that. At this point the president checked her sternly, begging her to moderate her language. But the jealous woman's heart was burning, and she did not care what she did. When the prisoner was arrested at Mokro, the prosecutor asked, "Everyone saw and heard you run out of the next room and cry out, 'It's all my fault. We'll go to Siberia together.' So you already believed him to have murdered his father." "I don't remember what I felt at the time," answered Grushenka. "Everyone was crying out that he had killed his father, and I felt that it was my fault, that it was on my account he had murdered him. But when he said he wasn't guilty, I believed him at once, and I believe him now and always shall believe him. He is not the man to tell a lie." Fyodor began his cross-examination. "I remember that among other things he asked about Rakitin and the 25 rubles you paid him for bringing Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov to see you. There was nothing strange about his taking the money," sneered Grushenka with angry contempt. "He was always coming to me for money. He used to get 30 rubles a month at least out of me, chiefly for luxuries. He had enough to keep him without my help." "What led you to be so liberal to Mr. Rakitin?" Fyodor asked, in spite of an uneasy movement on the part of the president. "Why, he is my cousin. His mother was my mother's sister, but has always besought me not to tell anyone here of it. He is so dreadfully ashamed of me." This fact was a complete surprise to everyone. No one in the town nor in the monastery, not even Mitya, knew of it. I was told that Rakitin turned purple with shame where he sat. Grushenka had somehow heard before she came into the court that he had given evidence against Mitya, and so she was angry. The whole effect on the public of Rakitin's speech, of his noble sentiments, of his attacks upon serfdom and the political disorder of Russia was this time finally ruined. Fyodor was satisfied. It was another godsend. Grushenka's cross-examination did not last long, and, of course, there could be nothing particularly new in her evidence. She left a very disagreeable impression on the public. Hundreds of contemptuous eyes were fixed upon her as she finished giving her evidence and sat down again in the court, at a good distance from Katerina Ivanovna. Mitya was silent throughout her evidence. He sat as though turned to stone, with his eyes fixed on the ground. Ivan was called to give evidence. Chapter 5. A sudden catastrophe. I may note that he had been called before Alyosha, but the usher of the court announced to the president that, owing to an attack of illness or some sort of fit, the witness could not appear at the moment, but was ready to give his evidence as soon as he recovered. But no one seemed to have heard it, and it only came out later. His entrance was for the first moment almost unnoticed. The principal witnesses, especially the two rival ladies, had already been questioned. Curiosity was satisfied for the time. The public was feeling almost fatigued. Several more witnesses were still to be heard, who probably had little information to give after all that had been given. Time was passing. Ivan walked up with extraordinary slowness, looking at no one, and with his head bowed, as though plunged in gloomy thought. He was irreproachably dressed, but his face made a painful impression. On me at least, there was an earthy look in it, a look like a dying man's. His eyes were lusterless. He raised them and looked slowly round the court. Alyosha jumped up from his seat and moaned off. I remember that, but it was hardly noticed. The president began by informing him that he was a witness not on oath, that he might answer or refuse to answer, but that, of course, he must bear witness according to his conscience, and so on, and so on. Ivan listened and looked at him blankly, but his face gradually relaxed into a smile, and as soon as the president, looking at him in astonishment, finished, he left outright. Well, and what else? He asked in a loud voice. There was a hush in the court. There was a feeling of something strange. The president showed signs of uneasiness. "You are perhaps still unwell," he began, looking everywhere for the usher. "Don't trouble yourself, Your Excellency. I am well enough and can tell you something interesting." Ivan answered with sudden calmness and respectfulness. "You have some special communication to make." The president went on, still mistrustfully. Ivan looked down, waited a few seconds, and, raising his head, answered, almost stammering, "No, I haven't. I have nothing particular." They began asking him questions. He answered, as it were, reluctantly, with extreme brevity, with a sort of disgust which grew more and more marked, though he answered rationally. To many questions he answered that he did not know. He knew nothing of his father's money relations with Dmitri. "I wasn't interested in the subject," he added. Threats to murder his father he had heard from the prisoner. Of the money in the envelope he had heard from Smerdyakov. The same thing over and over again. He interrupted suddenly, with a look of weariness. "I have nothing particular to tell the court. I see you are unwell and understand your feelings," the president began. He turned to the prosecutor and the counsel for the defense to invite them to examine the witness, if necessary, when Ivan suddenly asked in an exhausted voice, "Let me go, Your Excellency. I feel very ill." And with these words, without waiting for permission, he turned to walk out of the court. But after taking 4 steps he stood still, as though he had reached a decision, smiled slowly, and went back. "I am like the peasant girl, Your Excellency. You know. How does it go? I'll stand up if I like, and I won't if I don't." They were trying to put on her seraphim to take her to church to be married, and she said, "I'll stand up if I like, and I won't if I don't." It's in some book about the peasantry. "What do you mean by that?" the president asked severely. "Why, this." Ivan suddenly pulled out a roll of notes. "Here's the money. The notes that lay in that envelope." He nodded towards the table on which lay the material evidence for the sake of which our father was murdered. "Where shall I put them?" "Mr. Superintendent, take them." The usher of the court took the whole roll and handed it to the president. "How could this money have come into your possession if it is the same money?" the president asked wonderingly. "I got them from Smerdyakov, from the murderer. Yesterday, I was with him just before he hanged himself. It was he, not my brother, killed our father. He murdered him and I incited him to do it. Who doesn't desire his father's death? Are you in your right mind?" Broke involuntarily from the president. "I should think I am in my right mind, in the same nasty mind as all of you, as all these ugly faces." He turned suddenly to the audience. "My father has been murdered and they pretend they are horrified," he snarled with furious contempt. "They keep up the sham with one another. Liars. They all desire the death of their fathers. One reptile devours another. If there hadn't been a murder, they'd have been angry and gone home ill-humored. It's a spectacle they want. Panem at circenses. Though I am one to talk. Have you any water? Give me a drink for Christ's sake." He suddenly clutched his head. The usher at once approached him. Alyosha jumped up and cried, "He is ill. Don't believe him. He has brain fever." Katerina Ivanovna rose impulsively from her seat and, rigid with horror, gazed at Ivan. Mitya stood up and greedily looked at his brother and listened to him with a wild, strange smile. "Don't disturb yourselves. I am not mad. I'm only a murderer," Ivan began again. "You can't expect eloquence from a murderer," he added suddenly for some reason and left a queer laugh. The prosecutor bent over to the president in obvious dismay. The 2 other judges communicated in agitated whispers. Fatyukovich pricked up his ears as he listened. The hall was hushed in expectation. The president seemed suddenly to recollect himself. "Witness, your words are incomprehensible and impossible here. Calm yourself, if you can, and tell your story. If you really have something to tell, how can you confirm your statement, if indeed you are not delirious?" "That's just it. I have no proof. That cursed Smerdyakov won't send you proofs from the other world, in an envelope. You think of nothing but envelopation is enough. I've no witnesses, except one, perhaps." He smiled thoughtfully. "Who is your witness?" "He has a tail, Your Excellency, and that would be irregular." The diabolnexist point. Don't pay attention. He is a paltry, pitiful devil, he added suddenly. He ceased laughing and spoke as it were, confidentially. He is here somewhere, no doubt under that table with the material evidence on it, perhaps. Where should he sit if not there? You see, listen to me. I told him I don't want to keep quiet, and he talked about the geological cataclysm. Idiocy. Come, release the monster. Has been singing a hymn. That's because his heart is light. It's like a drunken man in the street bawling how Vanka went to Petersburg, and I would give a quadrillions for 2 seconds of joy. You don't know me. Oh, how stupid all this business is. Come, take me instead of him. I didn't come for nothing. Why is everything so stupid? And he began slowly, and as it were reflectively, looking round him again. But the court was all excitement by now. Alyosha rushed towards him, but the court usher had already seized Ivan by the arm. What are you about? He cried, staring into the man's face, and suddenly seizing him by the shoulders, he flung him violently to the floor. But the police were on the spot and he was seized. He screamed furiously, and all the time he was being removed, he yelled and screamed something incoherent. The whole court was thrown into confusion. I don't remember everything as it happened. I was excited myself and could not follow. I only know that afterwards, when everything was quiet again and everyone understood what had happened, the court usher came in for a reprimand, though he very reasonably explained that the witness had been quite well, that the doctor had seen him an hour ago, when he had a slight attack of giddiness, but that, until he had come into the court, he had talked quite consecutively, so that nothing could have been foreseen that he had, in fact, insisted on giving evidence. But before everyone had completely regained their composure and recovered from this scene, it was followed by another. Katerina Ivanovna had an attack of hysterics. She sobbed, shrieking loudly, but refused to leave the court, struggled, and besought them not to remove her. Suddenly she cried to the president, "There is more evidence I must give at once. At once. Here is a document, a letter. Take it. Read it quickly. Quickly. It's a letter from that monster. That man there. She pointed to Mitya. It was he killed his father. You will see that directly. He wrote to me how he would kill his father, but the other one is ill. He is ill. He is delirious." She kept crying out, beside herself. The court usher took the document she held out to the president, and she, dropping into a chair, hiding her face in her hands, began convulsively and noiselessly sobbing, shaking all over, and stifling every sound for fear she should be ejected from the court. The document she had handed up was that letter Mitya had written at the metropolis tavern, which Ivan had spoken of as a mathematical proof. Alas, its mathematical conclusiveness was recognized, and had it not been for that letter, Mitya might have escaped his doom, or, at least, that doom would have been less terrible. It was, I repeat, difficult to notice every detail. What followed is still confused to my mind. The president must, I suppose, have at once passed on the document to the judges, the jury, and the lawyers on both sides. I only remember how they began examining the witness. On being gently asked by the president whether she had recovered sufficiently, Katerina Ivanovna exclaimed impetuously, "I am ready. I am ready. I am quite equal to answering you," she added, evidently still afraid that she would somehow be prevented from giving evidence. She was asked to explain in detail what this letter was and under what circumstances she received it. "I received it the day before the crime was committed, but he wrote it the day before that. At the 7th it is, 2 days before he committed the crime. Look, it is written on some sort of bill." She cried breathlessly. "He hated me at that time because he had behaved contemptibly and was running after that creature, and because he owed me that 3,000. Oh, he was humiliated by that 3,000 on account of his own meanness. This is how it happened about that 3,000. I beg you, I beseech you, to hear me. 3 weeks before he murdered his father, he came to me one morning. I knew he was in want of money, and what he wanted it for. Yes, to win that creature and carry her off. I knew then that he had been false to me and meant to abandon me, and it was I who gave him that money, who offered it to him on the pretext of his sending it to my sister in Moscow. And as I gave it him, I looked him in the face and said that he could send it when he liked, in a month's time would do. How could he have failed to understand that I was practically telling him to his face, "You want money to be false to me with your creature, so here's the money for you. I give it to you myself. Take it, if you have so little honor as to take it." I wanted to prove what he was, and what happened. He took it, and squandered it with that creature in one night. But he knew that I knew all about it. I assure you he understood, too, that I gave him that money to test him, to see whether he was so lost to all sense of honor as to take it from me. I looked into his eyes and he looked into mine, and he understood it all, and he took and carried off my money. "That's true, Kotya," Mitya roared suddenly. "I looked into your eyes and I knew that you were dishonoring me, and yet I took your money. Despise me as a scoundrel. Despise me, all of you. I've deserved it." "Prisoner," cried the president, "another word, and I will order you to be removed." That money was a torment to him, Kotya went on with impulsive haste. He wanted to repay it me. He wanted to, that's true, but he needed money for that creature, too. So he murdered his father, but he didn't repay me, and went off with her to that village where he was arrested. There, again, he squandered the money he had stolen after the murder of his father. And a day before the murder he wrote me this letter. He was drunk when he wrote it. I saw it at once, at the time. He wrote it from spite, and feeling certain, positively certain, that I should never show it to anyone, even if he did kill him, or else he wouldn't have written it. For he knew I shouldn't want to revenge myself and ruin him, but read it attentively, more attentively. Please, and you will see that he had described it all in his letter, all beforehand, how he would kill his father and where his money was kept. Look, please don't overlook that. There's one phrase there, "I shall kill him as soon as Ivan has gone away." So he thought it all out beforehand how he would kill him. Katerina Ivanovna pointed out to the court with venomous and malignant triumph. Oh, it was clear she had studied every line of that letter and detected every meaning underlining it. If he hadn't been drunk, he wouldn't have written to me, but look, everything is written there beforehand, just as he committed the murder after. A complete program of it, she exclaimed frantically. She was reckless now of all consequences to herself, though, no doubt, she had foreseen them even a month ago, for even then, perhaps, shaking with anger, she had pondered whether to show it at the trial or not. Now she had taken the fatal plunge. I remember that the letter was read aloud by the clerk, directly afterwards, I believe. It made an overwhelming impression. They asked Mitya whether he admitted having written the letter. "It's mine, cried Mitya. "I shouldn't have written it if I hadn't been drunk. We've hated each other for many things, Kotya, but I swear I loved you even while I hated you, and you didn't love me." He sank back on his seat, wringing his hands in despair. The prosecutor and counsel for the defense began cross-examining her, chiefly to ascertain what had induced her to conceal such a document and to give her evidence in quite a different tone and spirit just before. Yes, I was telling lies just now. I was lying against my honor and my conscience, but I wanted to save him, for he has hated and despised me so. Kotya cried madly. Oh, he has despised me horribly. He has always despised me, and do you know, he has despised me from the very moment that I bowed down to him for that money. I saw that. I felt it at once at the time, but for a long time I wouldn't believe it. How often I have read it in his eyes. You came of yourself, though. Oh, he didn't understand. He had no idea why I ran to him. He can suspect nothing but baseness. He judged me by himself. He thought everyone was like himself. Kotya hissed furiously, in a perfect frenzy. And he only wanted to marry me, because it inherited a fortune. Because of that. I always suspected it was because of that. Oh, he is a brute. He was always convinced that I should be trembling with shame all my life before him, because I went to him then, and that he had a right to despise me forever for it, and so to be superior to methods why he wanted to marry me. That's also. I tried to conquer him by my love that knew no bounds. I even tried to forgive his faithlessness, but he understood nothing. How could he understand indeed? He is a monster. I only received that letter the next evening. It was brought me from the tavern, and only that morning I wanted to forgive him everything given his treachery. The president and the prosecutor, of course, tried to calm her. I can't help thinking that they felt ashamed of taking advantage of her hysteria and of listening to such avowals. I remember hearing them say to her, "We understand how hard it is for you. Be sure we are able to feel for you," and so on, and so on. And yet they dragged the evidence out of the raving, hysterical woman. She described at last with extraordinary clearness, which is so often seen, though only for a moment, in such overwrought states, how Ivan had been nearly driven out of his mind during the last 2 months trying to save the monster and murderer, his brother. He tortured himself, she exclaimed. He was always trying to minimize his brother's guilt and confessing to me that he, too, had never loved his father, and perhaps desired his death himself. Oh, he has a tender, over-tender conscience. He tormented himself with his conscience. He told me everything. He came every day and talked to me as his only friend. I have the honor to be his only friend. She cried suddenly with a sort of defiance, and her eyes flashed. He had been twice to see Smerdyakov. One day he came to me and said, if it was not my brother, but Smerdyakov committed the murder, for the legend was circulating everywhere that Smerdyakov had done it. Perhaps I too am guilty, for Smerdyakov knew I didn't like my father and perhaps believed that I desired my father's death. Then I brought out that letter and showed it him. He was entirely convinced that his brother had done it, and he was overwhelmed by it. He couldn't endure the thought that his own brother was a parricide. Only a week ago I saw that it was making him ill. During the last few days he has talked incoherently in my presence. I saw his mind was giving way. He walked about, raving. He was seen muttering in the streets. The doctor from Moscow, at my request, examined him the day before yesterday and told me that he was on the eve of brain fever, and all on account of this monster. And last night he learned that Smerdyakov was dead. It was such a shock that it drove him out of his mind. And all through this monster, all for the sake of saving the monster. Oh, of course, such an outpouring, such an avowal is only possible once in a life to meet the hour of death, for instance, on the way to the scaffold. But it was in Kotya's character, and it was such a moment in her life. It was the same impetuous Kotya who had thrown herself on the mercy of a young profligate to save her father, the same Kotya who had just before, in her pride and chastity, sacrificed herself and her maidenly modesty before all these people, telling of Mitya's generous conduct, in the hope of softening his fate a little. And now, again, she sacrificed herself, but this time it was for another, and perhaps only now, perhaps only at this moment she felt and knew how dear that other was to her. She had sacrificed herself in terror for him, conceiving all of a sudden that he had ruined himself by his confession that it was he who had committed the murder, not his brother. She had sacrificed herself to save him, to save his good name, his reputation. And yet one terrible doubt occurred too. One, was she lying in her description of her former relations with Mitya? That was the question. No, she had not intentionally slandered him when she cried that Mitya despised her for her bowing down to him. She believed it herself. She had been firmly convinced, perhaps ever since that bow, that the simple-hearted Mitya, who even then adored her, was laughing at her and despising her. She had loved him with an hysterical, lacerated love only from pride, from wounded pride, and that love was not like love, but more like revenge. Oh, perhaps that lacerated love would have grown into real love. Perhaps Kotya longed for nothing more than that, but Mitya's faithlessness had wounded her to the bottom of her heart, and her heart could not forgive him. The moment of revenge had come upon her suddenly, and all that had been accumulating so long and so painfully in the offended woman's breast burst out all at once and unexpectedly. She betrayed Mitya, but she betrayed herself too, and no sooner had she given full expression to her feelings than the tension, of course, was over, and she was overwhelmed with shame. Hysterics began again. She fell on the floor, sobbing and screaming. She was carried out. At that moment, Grushenka, with a wail, rushed towards Mitya before they had time to prevent her. "Mitya," she wailed, "your serpent has destroyed you. There, she has shown you what she is," she shouted to the judges, shaking with anger. At a signal from the president, they seized her and tried to remove her from the court. She wouldn't allow it. She fought and struggled to get back to Mitya. Mitya uttered a cry and struggled to get to her. He was overpowered. Yes, I think the ladies who came to see the spectacle must have been satisfied. Show had been a varied one. Then I remember the Moscow doctor appeared on the scene. I believe the president had previously sent the court usher to arrange for medical aid for Ivan. The doctor announced to the court that the sick man was suffering from a dangerous attack of brain fever and that he must be at once removed. In answer to questions from the prosecutor and the counsel for the defense, he said that the patient had come to him of his own accord the day before yesterday and that he had warned him that he had such an attack coming on, but he had not consented to be looked after. He was certainly not in a normal state of mind. He told me himself that he saw visions when he was awake, that he met several persons in the street who were dead, and that Satan visited him every evening, said the doctor in conclusion. Having given his evidence, the celebrated doctor withdrew. The letter produced by Katerina Ivanovna was added to the material proofs. After some deliberation, the judges decided to proceed with the trial and to enter both the unexpected pieces of evidence given by Ivan and Katerina Ivanovna on the protocol. But I will not detail the evidence of the other witnesses, who only repeated and confirmed what had been said before, though all with their characteristic peculiarities. I repeat, all was brought together in the prosecutor's speech, which I shall quote immediately. Everyone was excited, everyone was electrified by the late catastrophe, and all were awaiting the speeches for the prosecution and the defense with intense impatience. Fatyukovich was obviously shaken by Katerina Ivanovna's evidence, but the prosecutor was triumphant. When all the evidence had been taken, the court was adjourned for almost an hour. I believe it was just 8 o'clock when the president returned to his seat and our prosecutor, Ippolit Kirillovich, began his speech. Chapter 6. The prosecutor's speech. Sketches of character. Ippolit Kirillovich began his speech, trembling with nervousness, with cold sweat on his forehead, feeling hot and cold all over by turns. He described this himself afterwards. He regarded this speech as his Shaftover, the Shaftover of his whole life, as his swan song. He died, it is true, 9 months later of rapid consumption, so that he had the right, as it turned out, to compare himself to a swan singing his last song. He had put his whole heart and all the brain he had into that speech. And poor Ippolit Kirillovich unexpectedly revealed that at least some feeling for the public welfare and the eternal question lay concealed in him. Where his speech really excelled was in its sincerity. He genuinely believed in the prisoner's guilt. He was accusing him not as an official duty only, and in calling for vengeance he quivered with a genuine passion for the security of society. Even the ladies in the audience, though they remained hostile to Ippolit Kirillovich, admitted that he made an extraordinary impression on them. He began in a breaking voice, but it soon gained strength and filled the court to the end of his speech. But as soon as he had finished, he almost fainted. "Gentlemen of the jury," began the prosecutor, "this case has made a stir throughout Russia. But what is there to wonder at? What is there so peculiarly horrifying in it for us? We are so accustomed to such crimes. That's what's so horrible, that such dark deeds have ceased to horrify us. What ought to horrify us is that we are so accustomed to it, and not this or that isolated crime. What are the causes of our indifference, our lukewarm attitude to such deeds, to such signs of the times, ominous of an unenviable future? Is it our cynicism? Is it the premature exhaustion of intellect and imagination in a society that is sinking into decay, in spite of its youth? Is it that our moral principles are shattered to their foundations? Or is it, perhaps, a complete lack of such principles among us? I cannot answer such questions. Nevertheless, they are disturbing, and every citizen not only must, but ought to be harassed by them. Our newborn and still timid press has done good service to the public already, for without it we should never have heard of the horrors of unbridled violence and moral degradation which are continually made known by the press, not merely to those who attend the new jury courts established in the present reign, but to every one. And what do we read almost daily? Of things beside which the present case grows pale and seems almost commonplace. But what is most important is that the majority of our national crimes of violence bear witness to a widespread evil, now so general among us that it is difficult to contend against it. One day we see a brilliant young officer of high society, at the very outset of his career, in a cowardly, underhand way, without a pang of conscience, murdering an official who had once been his benefactor, and the servant girl, to steal his own eye. Oh, you! And what ready money he could find on him. It will come in handy for my pleasures in the fashionable world and for my career in the future. After murdering them, he puts pillows under the head of each of his victims. He goes away. Next, a young hero decorated for bravery kills the mother of his chief and benefactor, like a highwayman, and to urge his companions to join him he asserts that she loves him like a son and so will follow all his directions and take no precautions. Granted that he is a monster, yet I dare not say in these days that he is unique. Another man will not commit the murder, but will feel and think like him, and is as dishonorable in soul. In silence, alone with his conscience, he asks himself perhaps, what is honor? And isn't the condemnation of bloodshed a prejudice? Perhaps people will cry out against me that I'm morbid, hysterical, that it is a monstrous slander, that I am exaggerating. Let them say so, heavens. I should be the first to rejoice if it was so. Oh, don't believe me. Think of me as morbid, but remember my words. If only a 10th, if only a 20th part of what I say is true, even so it's awful. Look how our young people commit suicide without asking themselves Hamlet's question what there is beyond, without a sign of such a question, as though all that relates to the soul and to what awaits us beyond the grave had long been erased in their minds and buried under the sands. Look at our vice, at our profligates. Fyodor Pavlovitch, the luckless victim in the present case, was almost an innocent babe compared with many of them. And yet we all knew him. He lived among us. Yes, one day perhaps the leading intellects of Russia and of Europe will study the psychology of Russian crime, for the subject is worth it. But this study will come later, at leisure, when all the tragic topsy-turvydom of today is farther behind us, so that it's possible to examine it with more insight and more impartiality than I can do. Now we are either horrified or pretend to be horrified, though we really gloat over the spectacle, and love strong and eccentric sensations which tickle our cynical, pampered idleness. Or, like little children, we brush the dreadful ghosts away and hide our heads in the pillows so as to return to our sports and merriment as soon as they have vanished. But we must one day begin life in sober earnest. We must look at ourselves as a society. It's time we tried to grasp something of our social position, or at least to make a beginning in that direction. A great writer of the last epoch, comparing Russia to a swift troika galloping to an unknown goal, exclaims, "Oh, troika, bird-like troika, who invented thee?" and adds, in proud ecstasy, that all the peoples of the world stand aside respectfully to make way for the recklessly galloping troika to pass. That may be, they may stand aside, respectfully or no, but in my poor opinion the great writer ended his book in this way either in an excess of childish and naive optimism, or simply in fear of the censorship of the day. For if the troika were drawn by his heroes, Sobokovich, Nostryov, Chichikov, it could reach no rational goal, whoever might be driving it. And those were the heroes of an older generation. Ours are worse specimens still. At this point Ippolit Kirillovich's speech was interrupted by applause. The liberal significance of this simile was appreciated. The applause was, it's true, of brief duration, so that the president did not think it necessary to caution the public, and only looked severely in the direction of the offenders. But Ippolit Kirillovich was encouraged. He had never been applauded before. He had been all his life unable to get a hearing, and now he suddenly had an opportunity of securing the ear of all Russia. What, after all, is this Karamazov family, which has gained such an unenviable notoriety throughout Russia? He continued. Perhaps I am exaggerating, but it seems to me that certain fundamental features of the educated class of today are reflected in this family pictorially, of course, in miniature, like the sun in a drop of water. Think of that unhappy, vicious, unbridled old man who has met with such a melancholy end, the head of a family, beginning life of noble birth, but in a poor dependent position. Through an unexpected marriage he came into a small fortune. A petty knave, a toady and buffoon, of fairly good, though undeveloped, intelligence. He was, above all, a moneylender, who grew bolder with growing prosperity. His abject and servile characteristics disappeared. His malicious and sarcastic cynicism was all that remained. On the spiritual side he was undeveloped, while his vitality was excessive. He saw nothing in life but sensual pleasure, and he brought his children up to be the same. He had no feelings for his duties as a father. He ridiculed those duties. He left his little children to the servants, and was glad to be rid of them, forgot about them completely. The old man's maxim was apes molla deluge. He was an example of everything that is opposed to civic duty, of the most complete and malignant individualism. The world may burn for aught I care, so long as I am all right, and he was all right. He was content. He was eager to go on living in the same way for another 20 or 30 years. He swindled his own son and spent his money, his maternal inheritance, on trying to get his mistress from him. No, I don't intend to leave the prisoner's defense altogether to my talented colleague from Petersburg. I will speak the truth myself. I can well understand what resentment he had heaped up in his son's heart against him. But enough of that unhappy old man. He has paid the penalty. Let us remember, however, that he was a father, and one of the typical fathers of today. Am I unjust, indeed, in saying that he is typical of many modern fathers? Alas, many of them only differ in not openly professing such cynicism, for they are better educated, more cultured, but their philosophy is essentially the same as his. Perhaps I am a pessimist, but you have agreed to forgive me. Let us agree beforehand. You need not believe me, but let me speak. Let me say what I have to say, and remember something of my words. Now for the children of this father, this head of a family. One of them is the prisoner before us. All the rest of my speech will deal with him. Of the other two I will speak only cursorily. The elder is one of those modern young men of brilliant education and vigorous intellect, who has lost all faith in everything. He has denied and rejected much already, like his father. We have all heard him. He was a welcome guest in local society. He never concealed his opinions, quite the contrary in fact, which justifies me in speaking rather openly of him now, of course, not as an individual, but as a member of the Karamazov family. Another personage closely connected with the case died here by his own hand last night. I mean an afflicted idiot, formerly the servant, and possibly the illegitimate son of Fyodor Pavlovich Smerdyakov. At the preliminary inquiry, he told me with hysterical tears how the young Ivan Karamazov had horrified him by his spiritual audacity. Everything in the world is lawful according to him, and nothing must be forbidden in the future. That is what he always taught me. I believe that idiot was driven out of his mind by this theory, though, of course, the epileptic attacks from which he suffered, and this terrible catastrophe, have helped to unhinge his faculties. But he dropped one very interesting observation, which would have done credit to a more intelligent observer, and that is, indeed, why I've mentioned it. If there is one of the sons that is like Fyodor Pavlovich in character, it is Ivan Fyodorovich. With that remark I conclude my sketch of his character, feeling it indelicate to continue further. Oh, I don't want to draw any further conclusions and croak like a raven over the young man's future. We've seen today in this court that there are still good impulses in his young heart, that family feeling has not been destroyed in him by lack of faith and cynicism. which have come to him rather by inheritance than by the exercise of independent thought. Then the third son, he is a devout and modest youth, who does not share his elder brother's gloomy and destructive theory of life. He has sought to cling to the ideas of the people, or to what goes by that name in some circles of our intellectual classes. He clung to the monastery and was within an ace of becoming a monk. He seems to me to have betrayed unconsciously, and so early, that timid despair which leads so many in our unhappy society, who dread cynicism and its corrupting influences, and mistakenly attribute all the mischief to European enlightenment, to return to their native soil, as they say, to the bosom, so to speak, of their Mother Earth, like frightened children, yearning to fall asleep on the withered bosom of their decrepit mother, and to sleep there forever, only to escape the horrors that terrify them. For my part, I wish the excellent and gifted young man every success. I trust that his youthful idealism and impulse towards the ideas of the people may never degenerate, as often happens, on the moral side into gloomy mysticism, and on the political into blind chauvinism, elements which are even a greater menace to Russia than the premature decay, due to misunderstanding and gratuitous adoption of European ideas, from which his elder brother is suffering. 2 or 3 people clapped their hands at the mention of chauvinism and mysticism. Ippolit Kirillovich had been, indeed, carried away by his own eloquence. All this had little to do with the case in hand, to say nothing of the fact of its being somewhat vague, but the sickly and consumptive man was overcome by the desire to express himself once in his life. People said afterwards that he was actuated by unworthy motives in his criticism of Ivan, because the latter had on 1 or 2 occasions got the better of him in argument, and Ippolit Kirillovich, remembering it, tried now to take his revenge. But I don't know whether it was true. All this was only introductory, however, and the speech passed to more direct consideration of the case. But to return to the eldest son, Ippolit Kirillovich went on. He is the prisoner before us. We have his life and his actions, too, before us. The fatal day has come and all has been brought to the surface. While his brothers seem to stand for Europeanism and the principles of the people, he seems to represent Russia as she is. Oh, not all Russia, not all. God preserve us, if it were. Yet, here we have her, our mother Russia, the very scent and sound of her. Oh, he is spontaneous. He is a marvelous mingling of good and evil. He is a lover of culture and Schiller, yet he brawls in taverns and plucks out the beards of his boon companions. Oh, he, too, can be good and noble, but only when all goes well with him. What is more, he can be carried off his feet, positively carried off his feet by noble ideals, but only if they come of themselves, if they fall from heaven for him, if they need not be paid for. He dislikes paying for anything, but is very fond of receiving, and that's so with him in everything. Oh, give him every possible good in life. He couldn't be content with less, and put no obstacle in his way, and he will show that he, too, can be noble. He is not greedy, no, but he must have money, a great deal of money, and you will see how generously, with what scorn of filthy lucre, he will fling it all away in the reckless dissipation of one night. But if he has not money, he will show what he is ready to do to get it when he is in great need of it. But all this later. Let us take events in their chronological order. First, we have before us a poor, abandoned child, running about the backyard without boots on his feet, as our worthy and esteemed fellow citizen of foreign origin, alas, expressed it just now. I repeat it again. I yield to no one the defense of the criminal. I am here to accuse him, but to defend him also. Yes, I, too, am human. I, too, can weigh the influence of home and childhood on the character. But the boy grows up and becomes an officer. For a duel and other reckless conduct, he is exiled to one of the remote frontier towns of Russia. There he led a wild life as an officer, and, of course, he needed money before all things. And so after prolonged disputes he came to a settlement with his father, and the last 6,000 was sent him. A letter is in existence in which he practically gives up his claim to the rest and settles his conflict with his father over the inheritance on the payment of this 6,000. Then came his meeting with a young girl of lofty character and brilliant education. Oh, I do not venture to repeat the details, you have only just heard them. Honor, self-sacrifice was shown there, and I will be silent. The figure of the young officer, frivolous and profligate, doing homage to true nobility and a lofty ideal, was shown in a very sympathetic light before us. But the other side of the medal was unexpectedly turned to us immediately after in this very court. Again, I will not venture to conjecture why it happened so, but there were causes. The same lady, bathed in tears of long-concealed indignation, alleged that he of all men, had despised her for her action, which, though incautious, reckless perhaps, was still dictated by lofty and generous motives. He, the girl's betrothed, looked at her with that smile of mockery, which was more insufferable from him than from anyone. And knowing that he had already deceived her, he had deceived her, believing that she was bound to endure everything from him, even treachery. She intentionally offered him 3,000 rubles, and clearly let him understand that she was offering him money to deceive her. Well, will you take it or not? Are you so lost to shame? Was the dumb question in her scrutinizing eyes. He looked at her, saw clearly what was in her mind, has admitted here before you that he understood it all, appropriated that 3,000 unconditionally, and squandered it into days with the new object of his affections. What are we to believe, then? The first legend of the young officer sacrificing his last farthing in a noble impulse of generosity and doing reverence to virtue, or this other revolting picture? As a rule, between two extremes one has to find the mean, but in the present case this is not true. The probability is that in the first case he was genuinely noble, and in the second as genuinely base. And why? Because he was of the broad Karamazov character. That's just what I'm leading up to, capable of combining the most incongruous contradictions, and capable of the greatest heights and of the greatest depths. Remember the brilliant remark made by a young observer who has seen the Karamazov family at close quarters. Reckon, the sense of their own degradation is as essential to those reckless, unbridled natures as the sense of their lofty generosity. And that's true, they need continually this unnatural mixture, two extremes at the same moment, or they are miserable and dissatisfied, and their existence is incomplete. They are wide as Mother Russia. They include everything and put up with everything. By the way, gentlemen of the jury, we've just touched upon that 3,000 rubles, and I will venture to anticipate things a little. Can you conceive that a man like that, on receiving that sum and in such a way, at the price of such shame, such disgrace, such utter degradation, could have been capable that very day of setting apart half that sum, that very day, and sewing it up in a little bag, and would have had the firmness of character to carry it about with him for a whole month afterwards, in spite of every temptation and his extreme need of it, neither in drunken debauchery in taverns, nor when he was flying into the country, trying to get from God knows whom, the money so essential to him to remove the object of his affections from being tempted by his father, did he bring himself to touch that little bag. Why, if only to avoid abandoning his mistress to the rival of whom he was so jealous. He would have been certain to have opened that bag and to have stayed at home to keep watch over her, and to await the moment when she would say to him, "At last I am yours," and to fly with her far from their fatal surroundings. But no, he did not touch his talisman, and what is the reason he gives for it? The chief reason, as I have just said, was that when she would say, "I'm yours, take me where you will," he might have the wherewithal to take her. But that first reason, in the prisoner's own words, was of little weight beside the second. "While I have that money on me," he said, "I am a scoundrel, not a thief, for I can always go to my insulted betrothed, and, laying down half the sum I have fraudulently appropriated, I can always say to her, 'You see, I've squandered half your money, and shown I am a weak and immoral man, and, if you like, a scoundrel.' I use the prisoner's own expressions, but though I am a scoundrel, I am not a thief, For if I had been a thief, I shouldn't have brought you back this half of the money, but should have taken it as I did the other half. A marvelous explanation. This frantic but weak man, who could not resist the temptation of accepting the 3,000 rubles at the price of such disgrace, this very man suddenly develops the most stoical firmness and carries about 1,000 rubles without daring to touch it. Does that fit in at all with the character we have analyzed? No, and I venture to tell you how the real Dmitri Karamazov would have behaved in such circumstances if he really had brought himself to put away the money. At the first temptation, for instance, to entertain the woman with whom he had already squandered half the money, would have unpicked his little bag and have taken out some 100 rubles, for why should he have taken back precisely half the money? That is 1,500 rubles. Why not 1,400? He could just as well have said then that he was not a thief, because he brought back 1,400 rubles. Then another time he would have unpicked it again and taken out another 100, and then a third, and then a fourth, and before the end of the month he would have taken the last note but one, feeling that if he took back only 100 it would answer the purpose, for a thief would have stolen it all. And then he would have looked at this last note and have said to himself, it's really not worthwhile to give back 100, let's spend that too. That's how the real Dmitri Karamazov, as we know him, would have behaved. One cannot imagine anything more incongruous with the actual fact than this legend of the little bag. Nothing could be more inconceivable, but we shall return to that later, after touching upon what had come out in the proceedings concerning the financial relations of father and son, and arguing again and again that it was utterly impossible, from the facts known, to determine which was in the wrong. Ippolit Kirillovich passed to the evidence of the medical experts in reference to Mitya's fixed idea about the 3,000 owing him. Chapter 7. An historical survey. The medical experts have striven to convince us that the prisoner is out of his mind, and, in fact, a maniac. I maintain that he is in his right mind, and that if he had not been, he would have behaved more cleverly. As for his being a maniac, that I would agree with, but only in one point, that is, his fixed idea about the 3,000. Yet I think one might find a much simpler cause than his tendency to insanity. For my part, I agree thoroughly with the young doctor who maintained that the prisoner's mental faculties have always been normal, and that he has only been irritable and exasperated. The object of the prisoner's continual and violent anger was not the sum itself. There was a special motive at the bottom of it. That motive is jealousy. Here Ippolit Kirillovich described at length the prisoner's fatal passion for Grushenka. He began from the moment when the prisoner went to the young person's lodgings to beat. Here he used his own expression. The prosecutor explained it instead of beating her. He remained there, at her feet. That was the beginning of the passion. At the same time, the prisoner's father was captivated by the same young persona's strange and fatal coincidence, for they both lost their hearts to her simultaneously, though both had known her before, and she inspired in both of them the most violent, characteristically Karamazov passion. We have her own confession. I was laughing at both of them. Yes, the sudden desire to make a jest of them came over her, and she conquered both of them at once. The old man, who worshipped money, at once set aside 3,000 rubles as a reward for one visit from her, but soon after that, he would have been happy to lay his property and his name at her feet, if only she would become his lawful wife. We have good evidence of this. As for the prisoner, the tragedy of his fate is evident. It is before us. But such was the young person's game. The enchantress gave the unhappy young man no hope until the last moment, when he knelt before her, stretching out hands that were already stained with the blood of his father and rival. It was in that position that he was arrested. Send me to Siberia with him. I have brought him to this. I am most to blame. The woman herself cried, in genuine remorse at the moment of his arrest. The talented young man, to whom I have referred already, Mr. Reketin, characterized this heroine in brief and impressive terms. She was disillusioned early in life, deceived and ruined by a betrothed, who seduced and abandoned her. She was left in poverty, cursed by her respectable family, and taken under the protection of a wealthy old man whom she still, however, considers as her benefactor. There was perhaps much that was good in her young heart, but it was embittered too early. She became prudent and saved money. She grew sarcastic and resentful against society. After this sketch of her character, it may well be understood that she might laugh at both of them simply from mischief, from malice. After a month of hopeless love and moral degradation, during which he betrayed his betrothed and appropriated money entrusted to his honor, the prisoner was driven almost to frenzy, almost to madness by continual jealousy, and of whom? His father. And the worst of it was that the crazy old man was alluring and enticing the object of his affection by means of that very 3,000 rubles, which the son looked upon as his own property, part of his inheritance from his mother, of which his father was cheating him. Yes, I admit it was hard to bear. It might well drive a man to madness. It was not the money, but the fact that this money was used with such revolting cynicism to ruin his happiness. Then the prosecutor went on to describe how the idea of murdering his father had entered the prisoner's head, and illustrated his theory with facts. At first he only talked about it in taverns, was talking about it all that month. Oh, he likes being always surrounded with company, and he likes to tell his companions everything, even his most diabolical and dangerous ideas. He likes to share every thought with others, and expects, for some reason, that those he confides in will meet him with perfect sympathy, enter into all his troubles and anxieties, take his part and not oppose him in anything. If not, he flies into a rage and smashes up everything in the tavern. Then followed the anecdote about Captain Snageriev. Those who heard the prisoner began to think at last that he might mean more than threats, and that such a frenzy might turn threats into actions. Here the prosecutor described the meeting of the family at the monastery, the conversations with Alyosha, and the horrible scene of violence when the prisoner had rushed into his father's house just after dinner. I cannot positively assert, the prosecutor continued, that the prisoner fully intended to murder his father before that incident. Yet the idea had several times presented itself to him, and he had deliberated on it, for that we have facts, witnesses, and his own words. I confess, gentlemen of the jury, he added, that till today I have been uncertain whether to attribute to the prisoner conscious premeditation. I was firmly convinced that he had pictured the fatal moment beforehand, but had only pictured it, contemplating it as a possibility. He had not definitely considered when and how he might commit the crime. But I was only uncertain till today, till that fatal document was presented to the court just now. You yourselves heard that young lady's exclamation, "It is the plan, the program of the murder." That is how she defined that miserable, drunken letter of the unhappy prisoner. And, in fact, from that letter we see that the whole fact of the murder was premeditated. It was written 2 days before, and so we know now for a fact that, 48 hours before the perpetration of his terrible design, the prisoner swore that, if he could not get money next day, he would murder his father in order to take the envelope with the notes from under his pillow as soon as Ivan had left. As soon as Ivan had gone. Oh, I hear that. So he had thought everything out, weighing every circumstance, and he carried it all out just as he had written it. The proof of premeditation is conclusive. The crime must have been committed for the sake of the money. That is stated clearly. That is written and signed. The prisoner does not deny his signature.